Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on the next era of work in APAC and the world. I'm Yumiko Ono, and I'm an editor for the Wall Street Journal in Singapore. I'm delighted to be moderating a very timely panel discussion with professors from the University of Wollongong and editors at the Wall Street Journal. And special thanks to the UOW for hosting this event. And I'm thrilled to see that so many of you are participating from so many parts of the world. I just saw Barcelona, Dubai, Indonesia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Australia. That is so great. So we'll be spending the first 60 minutes on the discussion, followed by a Q&A. And some of you have already submitted your questions, which is great. Thank you so much for doing that. And if you think of a question during the conversation, please put them into the Q&A box. And my colleague Wenjie Ding will compile them and we'll address as many as we can in the second part of this event. This event will be recorded and shared later for those of you who didn't get a chance to attend it live. And now I will first turn it over to Sue Turnbull, Senior Professor of Communications and Media at UOW, to say a few words. Sue.
Thank you, Yumiko. Hello, everyone. I'm Sue Turnbull, and a special wave to our colleagues in Hong Kong and Dubai. I'm Senior Professor of Communication and Media at the University of Wollongong. And on behalf of the university, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which the University of Wollongong is situated. We pay our respects to Aboriginal elders past, present, and emerging, who are the knowledge holders and teachers, and we acknowledge their continued spiritual and cultural connection to country. And it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Patricia Davidson and Professor Grace McCarthy. Trish joined the University of Wollongong as Vice Chancellor in May 2021. Prior to her current role, Trish was Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing in Baltimore, and here's my cat, Surrey, in the United States. In 2021, she was the recipient of the Consortium of Universities for Global Health Distinguished Leader Award. This honor celebrates her exceptional contributions to the advancement of global health worldwide. Professor Davidson is a global leader in nursing, healthcare, and advocacy, and last year, COVID placed her on the front line of the pandemic, where she spent time voluntarily giving vaccinations in Baltimore alongside her colleagues. Professor Grace McCarthy is Dean of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Grace is recognised as an exceptional teacher and has been awarded an Australian Government Office of Learning and Teaching citation for her outstanding contributions to teaching and learning. Her many years of experience in a large multinational company, combined with her research in leadership and coaching, have given her rich insights into what works well when working or studying remotely. So back to Yumiko, without the cat. She's gone again.
Thank you, Sue. And remember the time when the BBC Dad, the baby came in and it made the front page of the Wall Street Journal, but now this is so normal. Nobody is surprised. And hello to your cat. On my end, I want to introduce David Winning, Bureau Chief of the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones Newswires in Australia and New Zealand. David leads a team of reporters in Sydney and has 15 years of journalism experience. He spent several years also reporting in China. He joined Dow Jones Newswires in Beijing in 2006. And I want to introduce Fred Dvorak, who is roving senior reporter in Asia at the Journal and who is joining us from Tokyo. Fred has 2 decades of experience in journalism, including in Tokyo, San Francisco, Toronto, and Hong Kong, where she was business editor and finance editor in Asia. So I want to start by introducing the topics that we'll be covering. The pandemic has caused a slew of changes at work, not just working from home and using Zoom, but also a lot of longer term changes. So here are some of the topics that we'll be covering in more depth. We'll start with health and work. Companies are now more responsible for the health of their workers. So how should they juggle the safety of the workplace versus the privacy of their workers? We'll be talking about corporate strategy and the global economy, including changes in mobility of talent. We'll be talking about leadership. So what kind of leadership skills are needed in this post-pandemic workplace? And how is that different from before? And finally, we'll be discussing something that's close to the hearts of many of you, the future workers of the future, students. So what are some of the skills that are needed to succeed in the new workplace? And what are some industries that have more potential than others in the post-pandemic era? Now, before we get into each of these topic areas, I want to start by asking each panelist to give a very quick anecdote on something that surprised you about working during the pandemic. And I'll start with myself. So for me, I just moved to Singapore from Hong Kong for the journal, and there was so much added paperwork. There was a super slim window which I could enter into Singapore. My flight was canceled immediately. There were ever-changing quarantine regulations, test after test to prove that I was COVID negative. I have made this trip from Hong Kong to Singapore so many times. It's a 3-hour flight with not even a time zone change. I thought nothing of it until now when it was so much a bigger deal. So that made me think that for a global company, it's so common to have people posted outside their home countries. But now that I'm in Singapore, I'm not going to go back to my home country, Japan, for a while. So it's going to be, it's kind of a big deal to be posted internationally. It's a big commitment. So that's my anecdote. Trish, I'd like to start with you.
Thanks so much, Yumiko and our colleagues, for the opportunity to be here today. You know, what has surprised me during the pandemic, and as you mentioned, I sort of spent a year and a half in the US in the pandemic and came back to Australia, is how important the workplace actually is to many people in terms of a source of support and information and connectivity. And I think that's very different to our previous, 9-to-5 lives where it was work, but not so integrated in our lives.
Absolutely, that is a big change. Thank you, Trish. Grace, how about you?
Well, one of the things that surprised me amidst all the talk of social isolation was that last year when the pandemic started, we got to know our neighbours better than we had before. So we live in a small house surrounded by blocks of apartments. And before the pandemic, people would arrive home and drive into their garages. We would never see them again because they didn't have gardens. So with the pandemic, people were buying pandemic puppies. So we would see them out taking their puppies for walks. And our lime tree, a big old lime tree, had lots of extra limes, which we put in a bucket at the front saying, limes free to a good home. And people would call around and say, thank you for the limes, or they would make a lime drizzle tart and come and we'd get to know them through the pandemic. And that's absolutely extraordinary. And I think that's wonderful that in it all, we still find ways of connecting with each other. And maybe there's some of this that we can take forward post the pandemic.
So connection with neighbors and with each other. Thank you, Grace. David, how about you?
Sure. Well, I'd like to take everyone back to March last year, where Australia went into lockdown for the first time. I had lost my mother the month beforehand, and she was in England, so I was planning to go back for the funeral, and I couldn't do that. And then we had the issue of homeschooling our kids at the same time, and we also had the organization of remote work with my team and getting them organized and hearing their hopes and fears going forward. So I took a bit of a risk. Now, one of the cliches of being an Englishman is that people think you're more at ease talking about the weather than your own feelings. And so I gathered the team and I just laid it out there. I said, look, these are the issues I'm facing. These are my limitations. And what I discovered from a leadership point of view was that it was quite liberating. And that, as we went and navigated the pandemic and the coming months, was that the team members felt freer to come to me and to say, look, I'm facing this issue, I'm having a bit of a setback in this area, and it opened up a whole new form of dialogue. And what I would say, my learning from this is that, as a leader, you can't offer a solution to a problem if you don't know it exists. And I hope that as we go back into the office, if that's the case, that sort of new leadership style continues.
Thank you, David, for sharing that. I'm so sorry to hear about your mother. Okay, so Fred, how about you?
A couple of weeks ago, I went to the first press conference where I had to take a COVID test to go in.
To get to the press conference?
To go into, yes, to enter the press conference as a reporter. So this was a SoftBank earnings press conference, and we were all asked to show up half an hour early, and they lined us up socially distanced on tables with a little, it's a new kind of antigen test. Only takes 15 minutes. You roll it around inside your mouth, and then you stick it on in the buffer, and you wait for 15 minutes, and fingers crossed that you're negative, and then you go in. And so it just seemed to me, Tokyo is now and was then in a sort of state of emergency, although it's not a lockdown, but it still, was in a surge of COVID cases, and yet here was one of the Japan's biggest companies showing how it could do an in-person press conference with a limited size in the midst of all this. So I thought maybe this is the wave of the future, that we will have to, we don't know when this pandemic is going to end, but we will have to build in these little extra time, these other kinds of measures in a natural way to try and get back to not the way things were before the pandemic, but something close, some way of coming to terms with living with the virus. And this is sort of what it might look like.
Wow, that's a fascinating anecdote. Thank you, Fred. And that's a great segue into our first topic, which is health and work. So we've heard a lot recently about companies, especially in the US, preparing to bring back their workers to the office. And then some have been requiring vaccine mandates and mask mandates, and some have faced backlash. So now it looks like some of this is postponed because of the Delta variant, but that's going to come back. That conversation is going to come back. We just had a story about this called which companies are mandating COVID-19 vaccines for employees. And Wenjie, if you could please share this story in the chat box. Thank you. Well, there was also a company that fired workers for coming back to the office saying that they were vaccinated and they weren't. So Trish, I would like to start with you. Can you take us through what kind of responsibilities companies have for the health and well-being of their workers, and how is that different from pre-COVID? You mentioned a little bit about this in the anecdote.
So I think companies or universities, have a responsibility for a population. And I think there's so much about COVID that make this more complex. Firstly, it's airborne. So, it's quite interesting. We've gone from these open plan offices to where, we're in very contagious situations. And also, I think particularly in countries which have really been devastated by the pandemic, there's a lot more likelihood that that people are going to use these measures. Like, I'm stunned in the United States that just about nearly every university is mandating vaccination for students and staff coming back for the new term. Now, that in the US is pretty amazing, because remember, this is a country where in some states you can take a gun into a library and that's okay. But I think it's really been the level of devastation and disruption that has happened during COVID. And I think that this is a very complex argument. But one is the social good argument, which we'd like people to think that was the main reason. But the other thing for companies, this makes good business sense, because the disruption to societies and economies due to COVID is something that probably many companies are not going to tolerate moving forward in the future. But again, wherever there is an issue of perception of civil liberties, wherever there is a perception of you have to do it, in some essence makes people push back a little bit. But I think, and in Australia at the moment, my perception is that everyone else is waiting for someone else to do it. The universities, we would love the government to say, you have to do it, and then we could say you could do it. The unions, I'm sure, would love someone to say you have to do it, because I think when we look at what's happening, people are scared. And I think this Delta variant, and in particular, the spread to younger populations has got people really scared. In the United States, there have been 50,000 hospitalizations for children with COVID and 2,000 cases a week. So as the virus burns through the population, we started off focusing on the very vulnerable in nursing homes. Now it's our children that are more vulnerable. And there's been some debate and discussion about how we value younger people more than older people. People have often said, and if you look at the media, people will name younger people that have died. But if the deaths are reported in nursing homes, it'll be like an 85-year-old woman in a nursing home. So I think it's a long and convoluted answer, Yumiko, in that we are really facing a very complex social dialogue. Each and every one of us has to think about individual social responsibility. And also organizations are thinking not just about their responsibility to the health and well-being of their workers, but their exposure legally and also their risks to business continuity and profits.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it sounds like, it's very hard for companies to be in a good place because some people don't want to come back to the office if the company has a vaccine mandate, and other people don't want to come back to the office if the company doesn't have a mandate. I mean, that makes it very hard for corporate leaders to know what the right thing is to do. Fred, I want to go to you next. And can you talk more about your experience at SoftBank? And, some companies are taking more of an active role than others. And I was surprised actually that SoftBank would try to have an in-person experience when there was a state of emergency for Japan.
Yeah, they've been real leaders in doing all kinds of innovative things in Japan, or things that are considered innovative in Japan. So from early on, Japan didn't do a lot of PCR testing. And that was for a bunch of reasons, some of them logistical, but it came under a lot of criticism because if you don't test people, how do you know how many people are really infected? And SoftBank, the CEO, Masayoshi Son, he's quite outspoken. He was quite outspoken about this. And so, from, I would say, April of 2020, SoftBank started doing extensive testing of its own employees, sort of as a laboratory. They did they have thousands of employees. They have, because it's a big telecom mobile phone carrier and seller in Japan, they've got a lot of shops. And so they tested everyone more than once, and then they published the results. They do, of course, they do telework, as most other companies do as well. They still, I think, try and rotate employees in only at 30% capacity. I've talked to various companies here, and they all have, or many of them have, sort of rotation capacities that they're enforcing now for the people who do need to come into work. And SoftBank also offered tests started offering up tests to its business clients. It opened testing centers and then started marketing and selling, distributing very cheap kinds of PCR saliva testing. And I've heard that they continue to test employees regularly. So their whole philosophy is, we want to know as quickly as possible where the infections are. We want people, if they're coming to work, to feel safe. Apparently, they also have some AI-driven, like temperature detector at the office, so that I don't know why it's AI-driven, but that's what they say. And they want to be able to carry on somehow during this pretty uncertain time when we don't know where infections are going, and when there is a surge in infections. I hear that the CEO Son-san gets tested every few days.
Wow.
And I've heard that executives have like cartons of test kits in their basement for easy access, because they're also expected to get tested regularly. So I think, again, this is an example of a company that's going quite to extremes to try and show that this is possible, and it's cheap enough to be doable by companies. It certainly goes against Japan's testing policy. But I think, it seems to have been successful. Other, examples are companies that, and this has happened in other countries too, but Japan had a company-sponsored vaccinations, where in order to get vaccinations done more quickly, the company would find a venue, they would find the medical team, and then they would organize the logistics so that their employees could get vaccinated. And I was quite jealous because, it was mostly big companies that could take advantage of that. And so they got their employees vaccinated first, months in advance in some cases.
Wow, so that's a big change.
I did talk to a startup founder, a VC founder, who organized 1,000 startups, of tiny little companies, and did a company-sponsored vaccine for 25,000 people. So I think you can see real differences in companies in the way that they are proactive in trying to figure out how to handle the pandemic for their employees.
You touched on many different points, and that was fascinating to see. And Grace, I want to ask the next question to you. So what is a safe workplace for the future? Is it, a company that gives people a lot of choices, whether they want to come in or not, or work from anywhere? Or is it a company like the one that Fred just mentioned about, you all are supposed to come in, but you'll be tested so regularly that you will be safe?
I think it's important to actually really think carefully, what do we mean by a safe workplace? And it's not just physical safety, it's psychologically safe as well. It's safe for people's mental health and well-being. So it's a much bigger question as to how do we, within our teams and within our organizations, what do we do to promote good health and not just wait for problems to arise and deal with them then? I think without a government mandate, organizations will take different decisions, and they will take them in line with their culture and values. And that culture and values will really reflect the top leadership of that organization. So I just think we're really lucky because we have Trish here, and with both her personal commitment and her knowledge and expertise, I think we can feel that we are in a safe workplace. And I just wish everybody else were as well.
Thank you. And I want to, Trish, did you have something to add to that?
No, I think, Grace is absolutely correct. And I think individualizing the healthcare workforce is going to be really important. In my time at the beginning of the pandemic, there were some people who just wanted to race out to the front and, just put themselves in the face of danger. And other people just wanted to crawl under the bed and wait for it to all go away. And I think if we do really respect our colleagues, we have to think about those differences and think about, what is some of the undue stress that is put on individuals. In Australia, we've had a recent, of course, things stop and start, but, about getting high school students vaccinated so they could do their high school certificate exam, which as a parent, can I tell you, that's probably one of the most stressful life events, I think, for a kid or a family. And then they're adding this additional uncertainty. And we know this is really impacting on the health and well-being of everybody. And probably the mental health is one of the most concerning aspects.
Yes, absolutely. Grace and Trish and Fred, you all mentioned how different companies and also different countries are taking different strategies. And David, I want to go to you next on the new topic of corporate strategy and global economy. I want to ask you about COVID zero. Australia's one of the places in APAC that are trying to keep COVID out policy. And that has led to closing the borders to many foreign workers, both skilled and unskilled, and students. And we've just had a story on how difficult that's getting with the Delta variant. What impact has this, trying to get to zero strategy had on the economic recovery, on businesses that will ultimately impact, where we work and what kind of work we do?
Thanks, Yumiko. Yeah, it's a good question. What we're seeing up to now is that there are short-term effects and long-term effects. The short-term effects are that we're seeing labour shortages in particular areas. I wrote earlier this year about agriculture and how the people in parts of the country like northern Queensland are picking things like papaya, just didn't have enough workforce. They couldn't bring in workers from the Pacific like they used to, and they didn't have tourists coming in that they often relied on. And that was leading them to plant less. And then as you follow that through on an economic impact, less supply, if demand stays stable, means prices go up. And that's been a feature of what we're seeing already, just in terms of like people buying at the grocery store. But on a longer term basis, you can see it rippling in other ways. You would expect if Australia typically took in about 180,000 people a year in terms of net migration. That dropped down to about 30,000. Now, in a normal year, those people would need to live somewhere. But if they're not coming in, well, what does that mean for construction? What does that mean for childcare? What does that mean for hospital capacity? And planning for that jolt, or planning for those people to come in has left a hole. But we're not seeing that yet because of the fiscal stimulus programs that the government's put in place. So home building is on a tear at the moment. But we're seeing warnings. We still have one this week from the Housing Industry Association that they're anticipating a big drop off in construction within a few years because there isn't going to be the demand that previously they would have expected.
So it might be coming. It's now you're starting to see what the effects are. Trish, I want to go to you next on the restrictions on the mobility of workers. Now, you managed to get from the US to Australia. I managed to get from Hong Kong to Singapore, but what has this restriction on the mobility of workers or students had an effect on the UOW?
Well, I think, look, this has had a really huge impact in lots of ways. And my condolences, David, to you, the loss of your mother. There's so many colleagues at the University of Wollongong who over 40% of our staff are born overseas. So, it's been really impactful. I mean, what has been really devastating to the whole university sector in Australia has been the loss of international students. I think from just not an economic perspective, but a whole perspective of internationalization. Also, as we look around the world and we, find, greater trends towards nationalism and populism in the context of increased geopolitical instability, there's a lot of othering and naming. And I think that's been very challenging for many people in Australia and people in universities, just identifying viruses by countries. One of the great things is that we've gone for the Greek letters to name the variants. So it's been a huge assault to the university, just economically, but also, universities are international places. They're places which thrive on sharing of ideas, of movement all around the world. And what we're really concerned about in Australia is our fortress mentality is going to limit the opportunities for our students, for our staff, for our population. I just think, internationalization, just as we can see by the panel here, contributes so much to the richness and diversity of the world. And the people who just want to put up the barriers and let everyone go away, you know, we have to counter those moves. And we know that viruses know no borders, and this is clearly played out. So I think the question that you ask is really important, and it's beyond the economics of, you know, of international students equaling income. It's about what do universities stand for, and particularly as we see these real threats to democracy, to free speech, to social participation. I would really love, and I truly believe that universities should be a place where you know, values are espoused, where tolerance and communication is really very, very important.
Mhm. Mhm.
Can I just ask a quick question to Trish?
Yeah.
On this, earlier, several months ago, I interviewed someone who is a broker for international students in South Asia for universities in Australia. And he said one thing that he had been seeing was students that were willing to wait for only so long for the borders to open. And they were starting to look at universities in the US or the UK, for example, instead, and deciding to go there rather than Australia because of the, you know, the border restrictions, and the relative border restrictions in those countries. And so I wonder if you've seen that at UOW,
Oh, yeah.
and do you think it's a competitive disadvantage for you?
It's absolutely a competitive disadvantage. And I mean, and beyond the, you know, just the constraints of the COVID pandemic, other countries such as Canada are also looking at migration pathways for students. And I think we have a rhetoric and a dialogue in Australia that is anti-immigration, if I can just be really upfront. And we all have come from everywhere except for our Aboriginal colleagues that are here with us today. Australia is a land of migration on the traditional owners of the land. But there is these moves towards nationalism and populism all around the world. I saw it living in the United States. Build that wall, keep out people from Mexico. We've seen it now at the tragedy of Afghanistan. Let's keep out the refugees. So I think, Fred, it's absolutely had a negative impact. Yes, economically, but also about Australia as being a welcoming place that fosters internationalization. That, I think, is probably one of the longer term barriers that we will have to deal with.
Thank you, Trish, for that. I want to go to Grace now on a slightly different, you know, we talked about what the government's policies, what effects that has on companies and businesses, universities. I now want to talk about leadership skills in this era. So Grace, your expertise is in the business school. What kind of leadership skills do people need in the post-COVID era? And how is that different from pre-pandemic?
I think the focus has to be more on people than it has ever been before. And I think we have to strengthen our listening skills as leaders. We have to get to know the people working with us as human beings, whole human beings, not just people doing a task, not just people doing a piece of work, whether that's with their hands or their head. But because the pandemic has allowed us those glimpses into people's lives, their cats, their children, to see the struggles that they have, but also sharing the struggles that we have. I think that is a huge shift. I think the coaching skills that are needed will help managers to actually be able to listen better to their employees. That gives us the benefit of all those ideas. It takes some of the pressure off managers because they no longer have to have all the answers. They can work with people to co-develop those solutions. I think our leaders need to have better understanding of data and how to communicate data and the decisions made using that data, And unfortunately, some of the problems we've been seeing with the response to the pandemic is because people haven't been able to communicate the data in a way that people can understand, and they haven't been able to communicate the decisions and the rationale for decisions. So this is also really important, that people can actually bring others with them. But to do that, they have to have the underlying skills, and they have to be able to work across, whether it's through a screen or work with people in the office, to actually treat individual as an individual and help to get the best from them. It doesn't mean treating everybody the same way. It means treating everybody fairly, but working with them to get the best from them in their circumstances at that time. So a lot of these skills managers have, but actually a lot of the managers don't really have. They kind of know the words. They know that they should coach their employees. I did a workshop with a company, quite a large Australian company, with 36 of their senior leaders. It was a coaching workshop that they'd asked me to come and do. And I said, well, let's start just by understanding what you mean by coaching. And there were over 36 different versions of what coaching meant in that organization among their senior people. So we throw these words around as if everybody knew. Everybody knows what leadership is. Well, do we? What does it mean in practice? Everybody knows what coaching is. No, but we need to have it, whatever it is. So I think if we pair that back to what are the real essentials, it is about human relationships in the context of an organization and where that organization sits in society, and how we can together do something that is good. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned communication of data. What kind of data are you talking about that leaders should communicate but aren't being able to do?
So, for example, if we are saying that our financial circumstances are difficult, how do we communicate that data in a way that everybody in the organization understands the implications? Because there'll be all sorts of variation of financial literacy in the company. If you take it about how we're going to make a decision on what we're going to do on climate change, how do we make sure that the people in our organization, that we all have a shared understanding of what that means? And if we start so our students are doing an absolutely fabulous job, and they're waking us up to the need. We know that climate change is as big a problem, huge problem. It's bigger than COVID, it's bigger, longer lasting impact. And if we listen to our students, they're saying, to us, they've said, UOW, you need to step up. They're actually presenting to a UN youth panel, and Trish and her executive have said, we support what the students are saying. Yes, we endorse all of those commitments that we want to make. Does that mean that everybody in the organization yet understands what those commitments truly mean in practice? Not yet. So we have to be able to translate data into something that is meaningful and practical, and something that people can do something with, so that it's not just numbers. Mm-hmm. Whether the numbers are about money, whether they're about people, whether they're about scientific measurements, what do they mean to people in practice? And that's a skill that we all have to get better at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So communication needs to get better, and also the sense of connectedness. We had a story about the title is very interesting. It says, forget going back to the office. People are just quitting instead. And then there's another one we had recently, remote work may now last for 2 years, worrying some bosses. So the sense of connectedness is really difficult. And despite all the communication coaching that we get and all the Zoom calls and the practice that we get here. David, I want to go to you next on, you've led a team of reporters all remote for such a long time. What are some of the things that you've done perhaps to make sure that you're all connected with each other?
It's a great question. I mean, what we try and do is have regular check-ins, both at a group level, but at an individual level. And whereas the different meetings to the kind of meetings that we had before the pandemic, it was often very much around stories, what are our news priorities, what are we working on, deadlines. Now it's part of that, but it's also asking them, what resources do you need? How are you able or managing to juggle this with other things that are drawing on your time? And plotting that out so that if they say they need help, we can bring that help in either from within my own team or from outside within the organization. And being aware, I mean, I think, you know, we've talked about this on the webinar earlier, but just being aware that personal issues are a drag right now, and that that people are finding that, that, for example, homeschooling is taking up time, and also being aware that the pandemic is delivering a different experience for different people.
Mhm.
If you've got high school age kids, they're easier to manage than if you've got kids at kindergarten who are very needy. And so being able to carve out time for colleagues that that have those drags on their time, and by extension their productivity is important. But the other thing is also, well, is to make it, even though you can't gather in person, is to have social events. Just have times where people can log on and chat, and talk about, the things that are happening in their lives that have nothing to do with work. And especially that's especially important in a lockdown situation where you're just not going to be able to see them. There's no visible deadline or date that says, we're back in the office. We don't know when that will be. And that sort of open-endedness is certainly weighing on people's minds and mental health.
Mhm. And I remember, David, you were telling me a little while ago that you did what you could in meeting with people in person. If it's like two people can meet, then I think you went driving around or something to meet people where it was possible. I thought that was very
Delta levels.
that was, yes.
Yeah, when when there was an opportunity, I would go to their neighborhoods, we'd go to a cafe, and have those conversations in person. But obviously that's much harder now.
Exactly. Trish, I want to ask you about how COVID has affected women in particular. There are lots of studies talking about how this has been a setback for many women. And what do you see happening, and what could be done about this?
Well, I think absolutely women have been the most effective. We know that women are over 80% of caregivers for even young children and older people. So I think they've really had paid the price. We know also that many women have lost their jobs, or particularly people in service industries, all the restaurants, hotels, all of those areas, women have lost their jobs. And some women have just not been able to continue with all the pressures. We know in the academy, in the universities, there's been, data that's showing that women are submitting less first author publications. And so looking forward, I think the impact of this pandemic is going to probably last a generation. People don't like to talk about that, but, I'm really concerned about what 2 years of fragmented schooling looks like. It probably is okay if your parents are, you've got two parents and they're both well educated and they can help you. But for many kids, this is going to be tough. They're going to lose basic building blocks. So I think we're going to need to firstly recognize, what we have to do for women to help them catch up in a range of industries. I think in particular, we have to focus on, reskilling a lot of people, particularly low income women. This rapid acceleration of digitalization has left many women behind. And also, I think we've just got to recognize that for a long time, we will be having to patch for what, some of the losses that people have had. But definitely women have been the most, affected. And then if I can talk about my own profession of nursing, you can actually, and the majority of whom are women, I think of my colleagues who for, every day, for over a year and a half have been going into those environments, and they're really struggling. Many of them are saying that they, can I keep doing this anymore? So I think, yes, it has, as in many times, had a disproportionate impact on women in high income countries. I think in low and middle income countries, the impact is probably so much more impactful. And we know that the education and income of women in those countries has a huge sort of flow on to the health and well-being of their families. So I think this is something that we really need to look at moving forward.
Mhm. And thank you for your honesty that, this really is going to have an impact for a long time. And we're going to have to spend a long time trying to catch up or patch things up, as you say. Fred, can you talk about the situation in Japan? And, Japan has been among the industrialized countries known to be a place where women may not have had as many opportunities as in many other places. And what has been the effect of COVID? Has it been a big setback or not as much? Or what are you seeing there?
I think that generally the trends are similar to what Trish has described. And of course, Japan never got very far as women's status in the workplace and in politics and many other areas of society. So to some extent, it has a low bar, but certainly, yes. I mean, certainly the problems that Trish has described are talked about in Japan too. I don't have a lot to add on that note, but let me just sidetrack your discussion a bit and say that women and vulnerable groups, and this is, of course, all over the world, but vulnerable groups tend to be affected sometimes in unexpected ways by the pandemic. And I'm going to talk about the LGBTQ community. Of course, in Australia, rights fully recognized, but that's about the only place in Asia where they are. And so, I have heard many anecdotes from around the region of ways in which the pandemic has affected LGBTQ people and couples. If health benefits or subsidies or something like that are tied to families, say, or family status, then you may not have the status or you may not be able to apply for them. I was listening to a podcast about the problems in Malaysia with this. I know people who had to move from Thailand because they were expecting a child and didn't want to get stuck in Thailand. They moved to the US, but didn't want to get stuck in Thailand having that baby because the relationship is not recognized. And if something were to happen, especially in this, very uncertain time of pandemics, they wouldn't have any kinds of, the recognition, the benefits that the child of a heterosexual couple would have. They were afraid that they wouldn't have rights, couple rights, and they're probably right. I know, and this is not just LGBTQ, but I know of plenty of people, and maybe it particularly affects gay couples, where one partner was stuck in another country because of visa, right? The visa problems, not able to travel, similar to what David mentioned earlier with, with his family in England. But this is, among couples where there's not, sometimes not the ability to live together, right? Because of visa, because the relationship is not recognized, and then people get stuck on different sides of country borders. So these are all only somewhat related to the pandemic. They are what happens to vulnerable communities. But these sorts of things are, I think, emphasized. They get worse, right? When we have an event like COVID, and you can see that the pressures and a lot of the difficulties have hit vulnerable communities of all kinds, I think, in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to sidetrack the question.
But thanks for this is a great way to talk about some of the other, what are the groups that are affected more than others? And that is something that, we tend to keep talking about the office worker and the mainstream office worker in a big company, and maybe that's what we think about a lot, but we should really be thinking about all these different groups that are affected more than others. Now I want to talk about the future of the future workforce and what effect COVID has had there. Students. So Grace, I want to get your thoughts on what kind of skills do students need to navigate the new hybrid workplace? I mean, what do you tell the students, your students, that they need to do? Do you encourage them to become familiar with all the tech devices and Slack and Teamy and Google Meet and virtual social skills? Or do you expect they should have tidy rooms so that in the Zoom background they look professional? Or what are some of the advice that you're giving your students?
We talk to them about resilience, because the starting point is for them to be in a state where they can learn. And so depending on different classes, but we might talk to them, for example, about, well, we're just going to stop the Zoom class here for a few minutes, and so you can just stretch your legs, so you can go and have a coffee, or you just go out in the garden, just look away from the screen. Even just that basic thing about building up good habits that they can take with them into the post-pandemic era, because we all have to start with our own health. If we're not healthy, we can't help anybody else. So resilience, good mental health habits, they're absolutely the basics. Then when we look at where they're going to work in the future, we do tell them they can work anywhere. Work has become separated from the workplace. We can attract talent from anywhere. We can get a job anywhere. But then we have to be able to work out, what is the culture of this new organization, this new clan that I'm joining? And that's not as easy to do in the virtual place. So giving students some things about how they might actually reach out to somebody else informally. So if they're in a meeting with a few people and it's their first or second meeting and they're just not sure what happened in that meeting, there was something going on, there was some undercurrents, I didn't get it. Is there somebody in that meeting that they can have a side chat with, either during the meeting, but be careful if it's being monitored, it might be recorded. Is there another channel they can use? People need some people they can trust to actually start working out, what is the culture of this organization I'm joining? Because companies are struggling with onboarding people in the online space. And we have to work out better ways of helping people to connect. Certainly everybody should have a mentor when they join an organization, regardless of their age, to help them figure out, what is this culture here? So that's part of what we do. With our MBA students, you're looking at a different cohort. They're working, and we'll actually ask them, what do they think the workplace of the future should look like? What do they find worked for them over this past 18 months? What would they like to take forward? And they will have different things that they actually relate to. But the main point we want them to appreciate is that we have to make conscious choices. Otherwise, things might just flip back to where things were before. And we won't have had any of the benefits of the pain we've gone through over these past 18 months. So there's a whole lot of things that students can learn, but part of that learning is through work integrated learning, whether that's projects, whether it is in virtual internships. The fact that we can't meet on campus at the moment doesn't mean that they just have to watch lectures. No, we want them engaged and active. And so, for example, our students can do projects with our students in Dubai, and that's fabulous. Because whether the client is in Dubai or in Australia, the students are learning about working cross cultures, cross time zones, and working to solve real world problems. They're not just learning that the answer is on page 22 of the textbook or whatever it might be. So all of these skills, we knew they were important before. The pandemic has heightened the need for them. So all sorts of different things, and having courage, I think, is probably the most important.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
and there are all kinds of ways to look, work with each other.
Yeah, and that inclusive culture, and you listen to Fred talking about some of those difficulties, all of us can actually reach out and be inclusive of each other, and that's really important for our students. And even though we don't have as many international students now with us, in the country, we can still benefit from our international family of campuses in Malaysia, in Hong Kong, in Dubai, and that our students have the courage to actually ask questions. And they learn about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals across all of our programs, and the fact that they can go in to organizations in a spirit of curiosity, not to go in as know-it-all graduates and say, oh, you're doing the wrong thing, but more understanding what's happening and asking the questions and help raising awareness, because we need people to go out and actually challenge the status quo. And students are how we're having a huge impact. We have impact in our research, but huge impact through our teaching, through our students, through our alumni.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Trish, I want to ask you about training and internship opportunities, because when everybody is not in the office and you need to get some sort of job training, it's going to be very different from when you just go into an office and see what other people are doing. Now, in our company, we've had remote interns for the newsroom, and I talked to one editor who said that, well, I let them hang out in my Google Doc and watch me as I edit a story, and then I talked to them about what I was doing, which is a very interesting experience. You know, you might feel bad about peering over the editor's shoulder so closely, but at the same time, it's also a remote experience, especially for the university, and and also in industries like nursing, where you might want more hands-on training. What are ways that students can learn the tricks of the trade?
Well, I think at the moment, Yumiko, we're kind of doing the best we can. And I really love that example of the editor doing, because actually often with my doctoral students, they sit next to me and I edit documents and track changes. So I think what the example you've given is someone who's very thoughtful and intentional and personalized that experience. So that's what we look for. We've all heard of students that get sent on as internships and find themselves at the photocopier. And we don't even do that anymore. That's a positive aspect. We've all learned to deal with less paper. That's much better for the environment. So I think we do need to do that. Can I tell you what's happening a lot in nursing and medicine and other professions is the use of augmented and virtual reality for training. But, I know it sounds bizarre, but probably one of the safest places to be in the middle of a pandemic is in a hospital where there's good infection control. So we've found that most of our students are, kind of getting their clinical placement. But, this is a people who are trained to use infection control, that have N95 masks that are fitted, and you're in a controlled environment. But I think there's huge potential for VR and AR, and I know HR companies are using that a lot. But we will come out of this. But I think it's looking at taking the good things and getting rid of some of the bad things. Like the photocopying was bad, trust me. I think also for older people like me, people have become more independent. They can do a lot of their own scheduling and stuff like that. But again, that's what we're going back to, the women piece. That's what I'm really concerned about, is those entry-level jobs that are going to disappear. The lovely receptionist, man or woman who greets you, that job is not going to be there. And so as we look at the future of work, we have to really try not to leave anybody behind. And that's going to Grace's point. We have to make our students life ready. Our governments would like us to make them job ready, but as we all know, the jobs that people start are maybe not going to be there. And certainly the nursing that I started 43 years ago is not the nursing of today. So we really need to prepare our students to be life ready, and many of the skills that Grace has mentioned, but this notion of lifelong learning and being curious and move are probably some of the essential skills. What I love about much of the MBA education is that it focuses on essential skills. Now, lots of people call it about soft skills, negotiation, communication, all of those things. They're not soft skills, they're essential skills. And that's the difference between someone who's going to be successful moving forward, because we know with AI, and particularly in health, that's just flipping everything. Physicians aren't going to be reading MRIs into the future, but there's always going to be people that have to communicate the results of an MRI to a patient and help them make decisions. So I think I really like to think about essential skills, not soft skills. And I think universities, we really need to prepare our students for a new reality and for the future.
Thank you. That is a great segue into the Q&A segment. But, I'm looking at, there are a lot of great questions, and we're just going to keep going with the topic of the future of students in schools, because a lot of the questions are from this area. The first question, I want to first go to David and then to Sue Turnbull, who'll be able to answer this. The question from Nikki Evans is, what does the future of work look like for university graduates with a degree in media and communication? David, what do you think?
Well, I think, I'm going to be very bullish about the future of media, as you probably would expect. I mean, one of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic is that you need reliable, trusted sources of information to go to. You can put yourself in a bubble on social media and get the information that can lead you down the wrong path. You can listen to leaders that will tell you to do things that then turn out to be incorrect. And so what we need is a new generation of journalists that are willing to challenge authority, willing to ask the right questions and to probe. And then they can put their stories up that are there to inform, and that, as I say, our audiences can trust. One thing that we developed at the Journal alongside many of our competitors was that we moved in parallel with our traditional skills of long-form journalism, longer features and in-depth reporting, to providing what we call news that you can use, so that people are able to come to the Wall Street Journal site and try and pass information that had just been put out there. I mean, we're even seeing it now in Australia, for example, when they bring in new restrictions. Well, what does that mean? What can I do? We have a mask mandate for outdoors in Australia. If I get a takeaway coffee, can I drink it on the street, or do I have to rush it home before it gets cold? So I would certainly encourage students to consider a career in media, because it's important and it's also rewarding.
Thank you. And Sue, what do you think?
Well, in fact, I'm going to take a slightly broader view and say that if you're in the area of studying media and communications, the possibilities are endless, because we're not just talking journalism, although we do in fact have a journalism degree at the University of Wollongong. What we're actually seeing is that every company, every organization, everywhere wants people that can manage the communications. So there's a way in which that capacity of knowing what platforms to use, how to reach audiences, which audiences, how to speak to specific kinds of audiences is absolutely essential in the process of communication. But coming back to David's point, it's also the critical skills in terms of how do you evaluate the types of communication that you're encountering. I mean, I've taught first year media and comms students for many years now. And one of the things that always astonishes me is that they've never ever thought about who owns the media and what that might mean for the messages that you receive, for who is controlling. And it's always a kind of revelation, and they suddenly become kind of very excited by the idea that there are people behind the media that they haven't thought about. So getting that critical awareness at the same time as you're allowing them to be creative in their construction of how to manage the media, I think that's what equips them to be able to go out there and to work with the Red Cross. Or we've got an honours student who's just gone into the Home Office in Canberra and is looking critically at various kinds of media and communications and able to manage those for the companies involved.
So it looks like you have a very positive view of, a lot of jobs will be available. Companies will be looking for communications majors.
Yes, I mean, I'm constantly being asked, have you got a student who could help us out with this? Have you got a student that could help us out with that? So the internship possibilities are enormous, but getting companies to actually realize that they need to put into a position a media communications manager and pay them, a wage, because that is a job, is actually very important when you're dealing with local industry as opposed to big industry.
I also want to talk about the mobility of jobs, and a lot of students want to go overseas or have more international experience after they graduate. Here's a great question from Gemma Moretti. I have future plans to live and work in Japan as an English teacher after my degree, which will be beginning of 2024. So is it still possible given the current circumstances? Do you think the world will open back up enough by then? And if not, what are my possible options? Fred, I want to start with you about Japan and your best guess and what might be going on in Japan in the beginning of 2024.
2024, let's see. Well, that's a great year because I happened to look up the International Air Transport Association, IATA, their latest economic outlook, and they expect by 2024, they expect Europe, which they think is probably the last market to really normalize. They expect Europe to be close to back to normal. Now, I think, and Asia comes. This is a bit optimistic potentially, but they think Asia will get back to normal. In other words, pre-COVID travel numbers before that. So I think they said Japan, China travel should be back to pre-COVID levels also by 2024, maybe in the early part. So if you want to come to Japan for 2024, it's looking good, I think, if we're to believe IATA. But I also think that that countries will still, the countries will still want to bring in people who want to settle and work there. And if you look at the kinds of travel that are most difficult now, it's casual travel. It's travel for a short time. Our business travel, our reporting travel, which we used to do all the time, or I used to do all the time around the region, is almost zero now. But you can make a move, as Yumiko did, from Hong Kong to Singapore, or friends of mine did from Bangkok to DC and back. So you could actually, I think there's going to be a big difference, and potentially continue to be a big difference between people who want to move to a new place to work and people who are going to just stay more casual travel, I guess, because we can't be sure of what quarantine situations or other kinds of restrictions will look like.
And Grace, what do you tell your business school students if they want to work overseas and gain that international experience? Do you tell them to wait for a while or have a backup plan? What do you tell them?
Tell them to plan, hope that it's going to work, and have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. We've all given up, and just plan B just isn't enough anymore. It's that resilience, that flexibility, knowing that our ideal thing mightn't be possible, but maybe it will be, because what we've learned over the past 18 months is that we know nothing about what's going to happen in the future. It's all uncertain. It can change from one day to the next. And we had several months where we were back on campus. We had students on campus. Everything was wonderful. The government was giving us vouchers, giving us money to go and eat in restaurants just a couple of months ago. And then we went back into lockdown, and it was harder when we went back into lockdown than the first time round, because it was the excitement, the adrenaline of the first time round, the terror, though it had kind of subsided. Now it was just, well, how long is this all going to go on for? So in advising the students, we said, well, like, just think about what you ideally would like to do and why. Going internationally is fantastic. Working overseas will give you experiences of the day-to-day living, not just the work task, but everything about the culture, different ways of doing things, different habits of thinking that you can't just replace with a Zoom call. So if you can do it, fantastic, go for it. But for the next couple of years, have some backup plans as well.
So not just a plan A, plan B, plan C, but many plans, so that just stay flexible seems to be the message. Okay, great. David, I want to go to you about how the pandemic is affecting university students who have been learning online. And then this is a question from Konstantinov. How, because they have been, I guess this is also similar to new employees who may only have done remote work, but students who have only done remote learning, could there be some sort of a they've been learning in a different way, and could they be put in a disadvantaged situation, or how do you ensure their fair and equal opportunities and the same attitude for the in-person people who've been there a long time and the people who may have come in new and have only done remote?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a big topic, and will affect the hybrid workplace later. I might actually leave the student element to Trish or Grace, but one of the things as leaders of companies, if we do have offices where we have some staff coming back in and other staff who prefer to work remotely, is how do we manage that on a day-to-day basis? What are the pitfalls to avoid? I think proximity bias is something that we should discuss. I mean, do you reward the people who you see on a daily basis more than people who aren't there? And we know that's something you shouldn't do, and then we need to avoid that. How do you conduct a meeting? Do you who gets to go first? Is it the people remotely? Is it the people in the room? How do you avoid a situation where when people are in the room that there's a perception that their views matter more? And I think these are issues that we'll need to work through. And I think that another broader issue with regards to how do we get people back into offices that we should discuss is, like, companies there's a limit to what companies can control. There's a lot that we can't control around getting to the office. And that's going to be a deterrent. Whether people are going to want to be on public transport where they don't know if the person next to them has been vaccinated. Do they want to get into a lift if you're in a high-rise building with lots of companies and you don't know what their vaccine policy? It may be fine, you've got a vaccine mandate for your own staff, but you don't know what the guys on the floor below are doing. And so, it may be that, you've got some people that say, I don't want to be doing this, and you're going to have to observe their concerns and manage them, and at the same time you'll be having colleagues that want to go back in, and you've got to manage those. So certainly I can see that being an issue for me as a leader, but I defer to Grace and Trish on students.
Trish, I would love to ask your views on how do you manage people in the classroom and people who are remote?
Well, I think this is just my thing. Like, personally, I like everyone one or the other. I think it's hard to manage. Like, we've been doing interviews, and I say, look, even though half of us are here, we all should be on Zoom. To me, it's just easier to manage, or if that's my way. I think many teachers much more skillful than me have some in class and some online. I'm really not sure how you do it, but my hats off to them. But, you know, they're really doubling their work because they want to be able to provide it to students. But many of the dynamics of communication that David spoke about are really important. But if I could add a comment, particularly for many people are on the call who are employers, you know, I think there's going to need to be a little bit more patience and kindness with new graduates. You know, I have no doubt that they have the knowledge and skills and competencies, but I think this pandemic has really impacted their confidence. Yes, we've done workplace learning and practicums, but it's not the real world. You know, there's probably something about, you know, an MBA student putting on a suit and going into an office and just thinking, oh, you know, this is what I'm doing. And similarly, you know, I can speak for my own profession, nursing. You know, they are amazing because they've learned to be a nurse in a pandemic, but it's not real. I hope it's not the new normal, having patients there without their families, with no physical touch. You know, I hope this is not the world that we're moving into. So I think learning to be a professional in those environments, it's not usual and it's not normal. So I think there's probably going to be some transitional times for people to get used to the workplace. And I think particularly for the new graduates, it's going to be challenging. I think for many people, they're the group that are really, if I talk to our Student Advisory Council, they want to be back on campus. They want to connect. They want to be together. They thrive on social interaction, as do most, you know, 18 to 25-year-olds. So it's a very different ball game to, you know, someone going back to maybe do an executive MBA who is already established in their social networks and whatever. So I think it's going to be just for employers to think about that as they onboard new staff will be really important.
Mm-hmm. And Trish, you have also mentioned how it would be difficult, or the entry-level jobs might be the ones that go away. What would you tell the students to do if they're remote now and then they don't have as much of an opportunity for in-person training, despite, you know, okay, there's augmented reality, but they may not be able to go into the office they want. And there are fewer entry-level jobs. Are there any skills in particular or knowledge that they should be acquiring now? I think there's some questions from the audience about this topic as well.
You know, I think the more skills you can get in communications, I really, you need to learn about social media. You need to learn about communication. There's so many things you should learn, and you have to be digitally competent and resilient. You know, some days, you know, for me, and I'm an old girl, you know, I go from Skype to Teams to Zoom to WebEx, and I think, oh, but you know, that is the future. And sort of being, I think the more digitally competent you can be, the more you understand about communication across a range of media. Because, I mean, it's not like, you know, before I would sit and yell at my assistant, Stacey, what about this? You know, now we've got to communicate. Sometimes you've got to really think about your communication because lots of things get lost in translation. So they're the skills that I think, you know, people should be learning. And as Grace mentioned, you know, it's about how you build your personal resilience and your ability to deal with ambiguity and uncertainty. And that's what this pandemic has told us. And as a health professional, we've let people into our world, which is all about probability, risk, ambiguity, and uncertainty. And that's been really disconcerting to a lot of people, this notion of risk. And kind of people didn't think about it much before. They would just go and, you know, go into a hospital and just accept what's there. So I think there's a lot that we need to learn about health literacy, financial literacy, so many things. So communication and literacy, I think, are going to be the passports for the future of work.
Okay, thank you. I also have some questions from the audience about a different topic, going back to the corporate strategy and global economy. Fred, I wonder if there's anything you've seen companies do here. We're talking about multinational companies, and how should they approach the whole idea of mandated vaccinations? This is a question from Dave Ryder. For highly individualistic countries versus countries with low individualism, you know, if a multinational company has offices all over the world, how should they tackle vaccination, for instance?
Wow, that's a tough one. I think that's one for Harvard. It's one for a Harvard Business School case study. I mean, it's true that companies around the world are struggling with this, and you know, we all know about and read about the problems in the U.S., which of course is a very individualistic culture, with mandates, even mask mandates, and certainly vaccine mandates, and the pushback that that's getting. I can say that Japan I don't think has really grappled with this yet. Japan being much less individualistic, the nail that stands out gets hammered down and all that. But you know, I think vaccinations are still not quite at the level yet where people feel comfortable talking about mandating vaccinations for their employees or for various things, but I think it's coming. So Keidanren, which is the biggest business association and sort of the most conservative business association in Japan, has come out in favor of tests and vaccine certificates for everything from entry into offices to, you know, theaters, stadiums, and things like that. So the question is great. There are going to be very big differences geographically, and having discussed a very different question, but similar in the sense of what do companies do when they try and roll out policies across different geographies that have very different responses or feelings about those policies. You know, the answers vary, but I think mostly the one that made most sense to me was you really have to be sensitive to the local branches and the local cultures. It may look very attractive to put in a global policy, but it is sometimes impossible, and it always works better anyway if you've enlisted the local branch and understand and you know, potentially have it led by the local branch, because they understand the facts on the ground, the local sensitivities toward, if we're talking about vaccinations, right, mandates and other things like that.
So the importance of not just trying to come up with a unilateral company-wide global, you know, mandate or rule, but also being sensitive about the local differences in, you know, wherever the offices are. That's a great answer, and it's a great important question. Trish, there's another question to you in the similar vein, which is from Danica Sarkar. Why do you think it is that governments are fearful to legislate the ability for organizations to mandate vaccinations, especially if they're talking about citizens need to get vaccinated on a daily basis, but they're not making it a requirement?
I look, personally, I think it's a matter of timing. It's just my opinion that everybody's sort of standing back and watching and waiting. There's been so much pushback against governments. This is part of the problem with the management of the pandemic, is it's been highly politicized, and you know, and that's part of the challenge. You know, personally, I think in many countries it will come. I think what is a more powerful strategy is by trying to, which again speaks to communication, is trying to tell people why it's important. There's a phenomenal woman, Senator Barbara Mikulski, the first female senator, US senator, and I had the privilege of sort of collaborating with her on a few things. And she'd always say to me, Trish, data validates, it doesn't motivate. And I think it's many of the stories that have changed behaviour. You can just see the vaccination rates in Australia are pretty phenomenal, but it's not been the data of, you know, the efficacy of the vaccines that have motivated people. It's been the stories of death and suffering and loss. So I think as societies and organisations, you know, we should try and sort of lead people there before we kind of mandate. But personally, I think for big Fortune 500 companies, this is going to be an economic imperative. The other thing is just a warning to some of the students who travel, check your insurance companies. Many of the insurers are, read the fine print. So I think there'll be many of those other factors that kind of lead companies to having to make those decisions. You know, if their workers aren't going to be covered by insurance, traveling, etc., without vaccinations, many of these things will happen. But it would be great that people actually feel that it is the right thing to do. But, you know, we've got a while to get there. And we also somehow have to remove the fear, because it's often the fear that stops people from engaging in even positive health-seeking behaviours.
So that we touched upon. Anybody wanted to say something? Okay.
Yeah,
We touched upon so many different topics today, from, you know, should companies mandate vaccines or masks, or what is the responsibility of companies, to what is effective leadership, to what are other companies doing, and also what is the future of the students who are studying now remotely in many cases, and what does the future of the workplace look like for them. There are so many more questions here, but unfortunately we are running out of time, so I'm going to end it here. But I want to say thank you to all the panelists for a great conversation, and I want to say thank you to everybody who attended. This was great, and thank you so much.